Hello, it's me, Mr. Milton, and today we're going to be talking about South Africa. South Africa is, at the bottom tip of Africa down here in the southern part of Africa. Um, it's a fairly unique story because unlike most imperialism, which we're going to be talking about, that takes place after or during the Industrial Revolution, this really starts prior. Uh, with the colonization of South, with this story, we're going to be looking at three major groups. The first is the Zulu Nation. The Zulu is an African nation that was living in this area. They're not the only people who are there, but they're a very strong presence. And we'll find that they also are a group that wants to extend its influence in the area. Then there are the Boers or the Afrikaners. I'll probably go back and forth with this term, particularly during this time period. These are the Dutch farmers that live in South Africa after 1652. And finally, there's the British. And the British are going to come to colonize or take over South Africa or Cape Colony in the early 1800s. This is a fairly unique story because ultimately it ends in what's called the apartheid government. The apartheid government is apartheid means apart or separateness. It is a government in which the small minority population, which was the white minority, created race-based laws to control the black Africans, the black South Africans. And so it's going to be a pretty terrible system that begins in 1948 and doesn't end until the 1990s. And we're going to be looking at that story a little bit further on, but this is kind of the backstory to it. So this is Shaka Zulu. Shaka is the king. He's the leader of the Zulu people. He is a very strong warrior. And they do conquer their neighboring people. The neighboring nations. This right here is the asage. It's the spear, and this you'll see this type of a shield a lot, particularly in southern Africa. He used in his warfare what's called the bullhorn method, and we're going to look at that actually right now. So this is the old method in which to fight, and you actually see this type of fighting in Europe as well, where you have the two armies kind of just go right at each other. Now Shaka is going to change things, and he is going to have younger warriors actually while you're going head to head to surround and envelop who they're fighting, and this is actually a very effective method. Obviously, they're going to run around in order to do this, but it's actually a fairly effective method, and he's very successful. Obviously, the Zulu also play with the terrain, so they're pretty effective fighting force. Now, when he defeated their enemies, they actually did give them the option to join. And so this actually grew the Zulu Nation, which is interesting. And you'll find that, there's lots of diverse groups in there. This was actually a pretty good fighting tactic. And they're actually very successful in fighting in general. And at one point, they almost defeat the British. But when the British advanced weaponry come into play, they're really no match for it. And you'll find that, early guns are not the most effective fighting tools. Once the machine guns develop, that's pretty much going to ensure European dominance. The Maxim gun, which we'll talk about later, is a very effective tool in conquering the indigenous populations. Now, the Dutch end up taking South Africa. It's actually the Dutch East India Company, which is interesting. And so they end up taking over Cape, this area right here, as they're going to the West Indies. Most of the other European nations at this point are going to South America. The Dutch are going around, and they'd actually develop a trade network out here. But this becomes kind of a stopping off point. Um, and the Dutch end up settling farms, and they would use slave labor. They would capture and put the local population to work in large scale plantations, and they use the Bible to say that slavery was okay, and we're going to see things really change when the British come, as we'll see. Now the British, they took over Cape Colony in early 1815. Well, actually, they started to take over in 1795 during the French Revolution, interestingly enough, because the French actually controlled parts of the Netherlands. And so this area, there was no one really controlling it besides the French, and there had been chaos. So the British started to colonize while that was going on. It wasn't until 1814, 1815 that they officially took it over from the Netherlands. So hey, there's the French Revolution for you. Now, why would the British actually want Cape Colony? I'll give you a hint. The answer is on this map. That was a dramatic wait. Maybe take a guess and ask me, and I'll tell you if you're right. Now, in 1833, the British are going to outlaw slavery in all of its colonies. This is actually a pretty big move. And again, we've talked about the fact that capitalism and slavery really do not mix. And so with the Industrial Revolution, you need to, pay people so they can buy things. And so slavery doesn't really work. And so the Britain's going to really work to end slavery. Now, this, of course, is not going to sit well with the Afrikaners who were there and who, want to continue slavery on their plantations. So the Boers, again, the Afrikaners, they end up fleeing their old farms and moving northward. And they are the Zulu who were there because they tried to get away from the Boers. So now they're fighting each other. And ultimately, this will lead to the Boers establishing their own country. So the Afrikaners fled north, and they created these two different places. They created Transvaal and the Orange Free State. These were both Afrikaner areas. Cape Province in Natal, they continued to swell with population, particularly with the British population. So we have the British over here, and then we have the Afrikaners up here. Now, everything's going to change because late in the 1800s, they discovered diamonds in Transvaal. And so I think you remember the gold rush in the United States, where you had so many people, adventurers, wealth seekers, going to California in 1849. You see the same thing with diamonds. And so this population of Transvaal then starts to swell with all these adventurers. And the Boers did not particularly like this. They were there first. Why should these new people have rights? And so they started to limit the people's rights. They started to create laws saying you need to be a Boer in order to do this. They created limits on how late they could stay out. Ultimately, the new folk who came there, they took up arms against the Boers. The Boers are going to blame the British on this, and this begins what's called the Boer War. Now, the Boer War is actually a lot bigger, and there's a couple different Boer Wars, but we're going to treat them all as the same, mostly for ease, but there's a lot more to the Boer War. So the war lasted from 1899 to 1902. There were two parts, but we're dealing with all as one. And ultimately, the Boers did a pretty good job beating the British. The British did not have enough troops there, and the Boers were, fighting for their home turf. But Britain then sent a lot more troops, and they started to win. However, the Boers continued to fight. They did not stop, and they started using guerrilla warfare. And so with the guerrilla warfare, we actually see what's called total war. And the British are going to say that there's no difference between, someone who's fighting and a civilian. This is going to lead to the British using um, uh, scorched earth, where they're pretty much burning everything that the Boers could use. And this also leads to concentration camps. Um, the British began imprisoning both women and children in concentration camps. And actually, there's probably upwards of 26,000 women and children who die as a result of this. Now, putting enemies in prison is not something new. This had been done with internment camps earlier. The Spanish did it during the Spanish-American War. The United States did it, but typically it's just for the combatants. This is different. In fact, the British actually sent their prisoners out of the country, and so the only people at these camps were the women and children. Most died. The 26,000 or so that died from malaria or dysentery. The conditions are actually pretty abysmal, and it's actually just pretty horrific. There are more images that I'm not going to show you, but some of the treatment was quite horrible. Word about this eventually got back to Britain, and they looked at the war in a much different light. They actually voted out the conservative British government at this point in for a liberal government led by David Lloyd George because of the absolutely horrific conditions of the concentration camp. So this is, this is actually pretty tough. And just so a lot of times when students hear concentration camps, they immediately go to the extermination camps of the Nazis. That's different. Extermination camps are kill camps. Concentration camps are more prisoner camps. The goal is not to kill. Extermination camps are different, and so this is probably the first. Well, it's definitely the first use of concentration camps that we see. So ultimately, the British win, and the Boers do agree to accept British rule. However, again, this sentiment in Britain is now definitely changed towards the Boers and towards what happened. They were promised that the Boers would eventually win self-rule, and they would no longer be a colony; they would be a protectorate, which means they would be allied with Britain, and they would be able to control themselves. Ultimately, in 1910, the Union of South Africa becomes a nation. And then it's in 1948 that the apartheid government is created. And that's going to be the government that's going to control South Africa until the 1990s. And we're going to look a little bit more closely at that when we talk about Nelson Mandela. So this is where we are going to end with this. And I'll see you soon.